Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast from EdLogics on Health Literacy 2.0 and Workforce Well-being. I'm Seth Serxner, Chief Health Officer at EdLogics, and I am so pleased to be joined by Dr. Jessica Grossmeier, who I have known for a few years now, Jessica, more than 20 maybe. So I'm very pleased to have you here to talk a little bit about what you've been up to and some of the topics that I'm interested in. So with that, can you give us all a little bit of your background, your kind of career journey and where you're focused these days?
Yeah, so I'm going to try to make this brief because I'm so excited about this discussion. And if people really want to dig deep, they can go to my LinkedIn site, they can go to my website. The focus of my work has always been in workplace well-being. That is the common thread, the through line. I am probably known most by people for my work as a researcher and in addressing, what is the value demonstration for investing in work site well-being, and then what are the best practices that actually help us to get the outcomes we want. But before that, I was a practitioner. So I designed and delivered these programs. So when people talk about health screening, executive physicals, group exercise classes, I can relate because that's what I did at the start of my career. And I think it really gave me insight as a researcher because I was able to bring a fundamental understanding of what we were trying to do with these programs, what it felt like to actually deliver them, and the challenges that we experienced working with individuals. And it was really that experience of working with individuals and seeing them progress so far. And then you don't see them for a while. And then they come back and they're right back to square one or worse. And that's really what got me into research because I thought we've got to be able to do this better than we are. So I ended up back in school for my master's of public health degree where I focused on theory, I focused on research and program evaluation because I was trying to figure out not just how do we use the evidence to design better programs, but that how do we evaluate to make sure we're actually meeting results.
Yeah.
And I saw you on a previous discussion that you had with Kumano, the well-being 3.0. And I really was at that place of being in the well-being, or we called it wellness 1.0 back then, where the focus was on individual behavior change. And
Right.
a lot of time was around physical health, maybe a little bit of stress management. But we were really moving into population health as I began my research career. And it was around understanding that when we bring these services and programs to a population of people, how does that shift our approach? One of the models I discovered when I was in school was a socioecologic model where we've got to operate at multiple levels of influence. And that has been the heartbeat of my work, trying to understand, well, how do we do that? Let me fast forward a little bit to get back to the question. So I did research for a while. I shifted from value demonstration ROI to VOI to we know there's value. Let's just design it well. So best practices. And that included culture. And then I ended up, and by the way, I went back for my PhD. But at one point, I started to feel restless. Here I was doing my dream job, working collaboratively with, the top thought leaders and researchers from around the world. And I felt restless. I felt this inner disturbance, like I was being called out of what I was doing. And it wasn't because I was dissatisfied. It wasn't because I was burnt out. It wasn't because I didn't like my boss and that the work wasn't challenging and I wasn't growing because I was, but I felt called out of it. And I wasn't sure called into what else. And so I took a sabbatical. And the sabbatical, I wasn't sure how long it was going to last. It was however long it took me to figure out what my
Yeah, we
next step
remember when
was.
you did that.
Now, I decided to do this sabbatical prior to COVID.
I
Okay.
know you
So
did.
I'm throwing that out there, but I actually started my sabbatical January of 2021. And what I did, Seth, is I really followed the breadcrumbs of my curiosity. And when I thought about what is it that really gets me passionate, what do I want to be reading all the time? Of course, wellness, well being has always been my life. But I was thinking more, well, mind, body, spirit is a more holistic approach. And we don't ever get to talk about that spirit piece. But I'm curious about that. I've been curious about that. And so I started to look into the research. And that's what got me down the path of my book, which was discovering that there is a lot of research that helps us to understand how we can address the spiritual dimension in workplaces. And that there's a ton of research that shows us how to do that, that we can do it effectively. And so I thought, I need to bring this into the work that I'm doing. And so where I've landed right now, I am independent still. Eventually I may be enticed back into a job, but for now, I am interested in translating research into practice, which I believe that's what my book does. It says, here's the research that exists. Let's distill it down and give you something practical. And I really love that work because it sort of bridges where I started out as a practitioner with where I went with my research. And now I'm bringing those two things together and saying, well, how do we look at this evidence base, whatever it might be around, and do it in a more effective way and then evaluate around it. So that's still where I'm interested
Mhm.
today. But I
Yeah.
have really been more focused recently on the more holistic approach to well being, which is mind, body, and spirit, not just mind, body.
I love it, and I have watched your path evolve and twist and turn. I will remind you that my PhD is in social ecology. So, yay, anteaters, UC Irvine, for those of you listeners that know my mascot. So, I'm all for that model. I have also described myself, and I think many of us kind of in this, our little group, science to practice, right? Science to practice, evidence-based approaches. And so we're all trying to do that because that helps the credibility as well as the outcomes and everything else. There's a lot of science out there, as you say. What I'm curious about is, as you say, that was your path. Where do you see the market? Where do you see employers? Are employers, we know that there's burnout. We know that there's mental health is a top issue now. We also know there are the quote the classics, MSK and cancer and heart disease and all the rest. This spirituality thing is a third rail, right? People were like, "Oh, I don't know if I can bring that into the
Mhm.
C-suite or whatever." But from a demand perspective, what are you seeing in the market around this holistic approach?
Yeah, so it's a fantastic question. And I would say when I started to write this book, it took me probably 9 months of digging into this area to really be convinced that there was something I could add. And
Right.
so once I became convinced of that, I decided to write it. But the whole time I'm writing it, I'm thinking maybe in 5 years, employers will be ready to talk about this because we
Yeah.
finally got them talking about mental health. We finally got them talking about social determinants of health, which was uncomfortable, still is uncomfortable. They're going to be bogged down in those problems for a long time. Maybe eventually it'll be spiritual well being. But then I started to see these trends, which emerged as I was writing the book around burnout and around high levels of employee disengagement. And, we saw the quiet quitting and all of that. And I started to look even deeper into the things I was looking at and the outcomes. Could some of this stuff have a difference? And in fact, there are extremely compelling research links between what I talk about in my book, which is having a sense of purpose in your life. And by the way, can you bring that into your work? Having a sense of social connection and belonging with your coworkers.
But
Yeah.
what about the employers? Like, this is, even
Right.
though we see the science, it's also to your point about uncomfortable conversations and,
Yeah.
people link spirituality to religion and faith and all that. And like, is that really for the corporate environment? What's the take when you're actually talking to these employers?
Right. So the pull is around purpose. And that comes because employers are starting to see these data in the surveys and the trends that some people are leaving work because of burnout. Yes, but some are leaving because they had this kind of wake up call of what's the point of all this? I spend so much of my time at work. What is the purpose and the meaning that I can find in it? And so that's where I'm getting a lot of calls. Employers are asking me, can you come and talk to us about this? So that is one that there's been a very strong pull. And then the social connection.
Are you then shifting a little bit of the terminology? The science is the science from leading at least with spirituality to talking about more purpose and values. And then does that take you to spirituality or no need to do that because it's the same thing? I'm curious about that.
Well, Seth, I heard you talk recently about the need to meet people where they're at. And that's what I tend to do. So some people come to me because they read my book, they like the more holistic approach, it resonates with them, and they're interested in how to bring the topics in. Others are seeing me on LinkedIn or whatever, and they're saying, oh, I saw you wrote something about purpose. And so I tend to go where they go and I don't impose my language on them. I am very curious about how they're talking about it, how they're thinking about it. And one of the questions that I'm tending to ask is, what inspired you to reach out to me? And so then that allows me to get into the conversation of the
Right.
language that they're using and what the pull is, because I've learned not to make assumptions about that. Some people, they just know me from the previous work that I did in my research, and that's why they're calling. So I think language is important. And as we know in the workplace well-being field, we can be a lot more effective when we use the language that makes sense to the culture. And so I'm not tied to using the word
Yeah.
spirituality. And I've seen, for example, in 2021, Forbes came out with their model of holistic well-being, which is when I'm using generic terms, that's what I talk about, a more whole person approach, a more holistic approach to
Right.
well-being. And in their model, they had what? Purpose, social connection, connection to community. That's what I talk about in my book. So I'm like, great.
So I think about when people are sick or they have a health issue, it's like the old saying, there's no agnostics in a foxhole. When you're sick, all of a sudden you're relating to some higher power. It's a big part of how we heal ourselves. We kind of like, try to tap into that. It might be very specifically faith based, spirits, or it might just be more general. So I've always felt like this is a little absent in our healing models, in our treatment models. Does that come up at all when you talk to folks?
It does. One of the books that I read last year that was so inspiring to me as I thought about how to talk about this was Lisa Miller. She's a psychologist, a researcher, and her whole focus has been on the connection between spirituality and mental health. The book is The Awakened Brain. And so she has gone into the deep neuroscience looking at functional MRI images around, how do the brains of people who are, quote, higher spirituality versus those who are lower. And what she's discovered in her research and the way she talks about spirituality has been very intriguing to me, because she talks about how it's about when the challenges in life gets tough, there is this breaking open. There's this awakening because now we start to ask ourselves these bigger, deeper questions. And she claims, according to her research, that you do not have to be religious or have a specific faith tradition or even believe in God to be able to be spiritual. It's how do we address these bigger questions? And the spiritual journey is the one where we go deep and allow ourselves to sit with those questions and work our way through them and find meaning out of the challenges of our life and push through them. Now, people who have a stronger sense of spirituality and a faith tradition, we know have some more resilience going into that because they've already done that thinking, they've got the grounding. But everybody has this opportunity when they experience times of challenge. And hello, what has the last 3 years been? It's been extremely challenging. And so I think there is this awakening to people saying, I want to do a little bit of deep work here. And I think that is in some respects why we're seeing so many quit rates, because the pace of work has consumed our entire lives now. We used to be able to volunteer in the community. Some of those opportunities haven't come back. Some people are so drained, they can't even think about volunteering in their communities anymore. And so work has become this all encompassing part of our lives, and people don't have that space anymore to reflect on those big existential questions. And so, for the organizations that are helping people with those conversations, with resources, with coaches, whatever it might be, to grapple with these big questions, I think they're the ones that are going to see people hang on to their talent because they're giving people resources to help them deal with this while they're working, and they don't have to quit their job entirely to be able to dig into these issues.
It's such an interesting angle because at first you kind of go, really? Employers are helping people figure out why am I here? The big
Mhm.
existential questions, the quote deep that you talked about. But ultimately, as you said, the data is pretty clear that when people do think about these issues and they do articulate it and they do have a clear sense for themselves and how that fits with their work, that they are going to be more loyal to that company or they're going to get the heck out. And that's probably okay too, but that they're going to be better off and it's better for business. It's quite the shift from our old-fashioned ROI work, Jessica,
Yeah,
and
it is.
whether that affects healthcare claims. Do you think any of this stuff actually affects healthcare claims? Is there any
Oh,
data
wow.
on that?
Well, I believe that it does. I mean, we know that people who have a stronger sense of purpose, for example, that they live longer, healthier, happier lives. They tend to take better care of themselves. People who are in touch with their values and what matters most to them, they take better care of themselves. And part of it could be they've got a reason to.
Right, exactly.
I think with some of this, when we talk about the progression into a community of faith or a certain set of belief systems, which by the way, employers are addressing this. There's now the Ready Index, which rates employers on their faith friendliness. So now you can get an award for this. And many leading organizations have. When people feel like they can be in company with other people who share their values and belief systems, that ignites something in them that might have been missing. And that contributes to their well-being, to their life satisfaction, to their job satisfaction. Because here's my employer through an employee resource group giving me this outlet to experience the joy that comes with connecting with other people who think the same as me.
Well, and I'm glad you said that because some of this is tactical. And for years, I've been a fan of ERGs or employee resource groups or some version of that. Different companies call it different things. But
Mhm.
again, like-minded people, whether it's working moms, whether it's African Americans, whether it's, a Christian group or whatever, letting people have that space at work, which is perhaps a little scary for employers to kind of let that happen. And yet it sounds like it's really important to make that space.
Well, it is. And, when I think about when we start to talk specifically about the religion and the faith based part of it, the specific wisdom tradition that you might follow, that is a piece of spirituality. It's not the whole enchilada, but it is a strong piece for some people. And when we make space for that, we honor the whole person. And I think really fundamentally, when I'm seeing a key trend today, when I'm seeing in the intergenerational mix in the workplaces, is this desire that, hey, if I'm going to spend so much of my time and energy and blood, sweat, and tears at the workplace, with the workplace, thinking about work, I need something back for that. And people want to bring more of themselves into their work. Now, there is this whole discussion around how personal do we want to get at work. Not everybody wants to get personal, and we have to honor and be sensitive to that. But
Right.
can we make space for the people that are comfortable with that? And can we create the psychological safety that helps people understand that we're going to meet you where you are as an employee, and we're going to provide the kinds of supports that help you to live your best life?
It's so interesting to me. I flashed on during COVID, I was working with a lot of healthcare systems, and I had a question that had never been posed to me by a CEO. And what he said is, how do I deal with political unrest at the workplace?
Mhm.
And the story basically unfolded that we all know the stories of how burnt out healthcare workers were. They're going into the break room. Somebody has a Black Lives Matter t-shirt on, somebody has a MAGA hat on, and I just want to get a cup of coffee. I don't want to talk about this, and it gets heated. And people are like, it's calmed down a little bit, but it was at a real fervor for a while. And so he said, what do I do about it? I've never had to deal with like, harsh political conversations and people really getting into it at work. And I said that I think it fits within this, in a sense, what you're talking about, this respect for diversity and to just let people be heard and to honor that position without having to debate it and to let it go. And I think that's where a lot of employers are trying to create this, there's terms, authentic self, whatever it may be, but to have real conversations and to let everybody have their position and it be okay.
Yeah, Seth, you bring up a really good point. And that's that, these conversations do belong in the space of diversity and that we need ground rules, right?
I mean,
So if we're going to invite this space in, it comes with, what does respect look like? What does curiosity look like? What does authentic listening look like? Not I'm listening to change your mind. I've been doing some investigation into intellectual humility because I'm prepared to speak at a conference that focuses on intellectual humility. And that's all about there might be some things, maybe just a couple things that I don't know,
yeah, it's the
right?
servant leadership thing too, right? You have to be humble. And we know from the literature on that too, that employees respect those managers that are humble and have humility and actually ask questions of their team. So one thing that I'm flashing on here, I was thinking, so I'm passionate about this health literacy space,
Mhm.
how it's evolving. And I wrote on my notes here, spiritual literacy. And then and I thought, okay, how's this gonna translate? So I've been thinking a lot about how people have a hard time understanding the science to practice when it comes to their own health, their own self-care, their own care management, and that of others. And that, in particular, this company EdLogics that I'm working with, they've looked at a platform, but the themes are use behavioral science and gamification, make it fun, make it interesting, use the data to make it person specific, not just personalized, and really understand that data. And then make it highly interactive with multimedia, videos, and things like that. And we found that that really helps people learn more about health issues, whether it's chronic conditions, but also a lot of people are going to it for wellness and for purpose. And there's actually a purpose module on this. And I'm just wondering again, are there ways that people can operationalize this literacy, this authenticity literacy, this respectfulness literacy? What are you seeing emerging just kind of very tactically or operationally?
In terms of how to apply this whole topic area of sort of spirituality to this.
Yeah.
So I think it comes down to really understanding fundamentally when we talk about supporting people's spiritual well-being, what does that look like? And to me, as I've thought about what it means to be on the spiritual path, it's about having the support and the resources to deeply understand and think about who we are as a person, as opposed to who you think I am, who my mentors think I am, but really understand at my fundamental base self, who do I think I am and how do I want to translate that into how I show up in the world? Okay, so now we're talking about values and beliefs and what are the practices that help us to show up as our best selves and to be authentic. Well, now we're talking about presence. We're talking about mindfulness and we're talking about values affirmation exercises. A lot of this does come down to understanding common value systems. And, you talk about the Black Lives Matter versus the MAGA, right? So you've got people coming in with these different ideas. And if we can begin to have conversations around, help me understand what you think. And then you hope that be reciprocated and listening with curiosity and non judgment, finding the common ground in your conversation. Because when you start to look at all of these supposed differences between people, you actually find you have more in common than you would think. There might be some things that your hot button issues way separated on, and we
Right.
focus on those. But as we come into the world of work, let's bring some common values. And I think those do get to the decency you talk about. And I think when we bring those behaviors in, the authentic listening and the curiosity and the respect and forgiveness is another big one. Kindness is another big one. When we bring these behaviors and supports into our work, we can contribute to our own well-being and to the well-being of those around us. And that does translate into a lot of outcomes.
And now we're getting to our old favorite topic, which is culture.
Mhm.
you know, and how you build culture. When I was at United, they do a lot of, we call it culture training. And one of the
Mhm.
exercises is an assessment. You do these personal assessments and you kind of show where you're on in the assessment, but then you put it on your back and you walk around the room and people say where they think you scored on this assessment. So you get a sense of how I think I am, but you get a sense of how others view me. And to your point, you start to get a better perspective on the whole picture here. And I think there are exercises that help people really unfold that. And we start to then shift to how do we create this culture of understanding, kindness, compassion. And again, that was Compassion was a great book on, business case for compassion in businesses, which initially doesn't sound like it makes sense, but it obviously does.
Mhm.
So it's just so fascinating to me that we have shifted from blood pressure sleeves and your early days as a practitioner, and I remember doing the bend flexibility test and they're telling me you're going to have back pain when you're older. I'm like, oh, okay. And then sure enough, I did too. Now we're trying to have workshops and culture around these other issues. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that these things they've been out there below the surface. Has the workplace been comfortable bringing them in? Has been the question. And so I think again, it comes back to there's been this incredible shift in thinking around what am I looking for in my workplace. Now, some people do want to keep this stuff pretty separate, and that's okay. But can we be bringing into any of our well-being programs these opportunities to think about these issues?
I wonder, so it made me think, and again, on the heels of another conversation. So each culture, each corporate culture has a culture already. I think about, like, I work with a trucking population or retail population. And I know my benefits leaders there are kind of going, look, my guys in the trucks are not going to be talking about this. But what if you could? Like, their purpose is more than driving a truck to A to B, it's helping families gain the supplies they need to thrive, or whatever it may be. And that being kind on the road or helping your colleagues is actually a great thing to do in our corporate culture, along with safety and all the other stuff. So it's got to kind of fit with the business culture. I'm excited to see, as companies embrace this whole model, how they turn it into their own culture. But anything you've seen like companies do that's kind of pretty cool that they've been starting to incorporate this in, that maybe is beyond just like you'd think a typical tech company or something?
So, well, there's one that I'll for sure name because they are very out about how they're doing this, and that's Unilever. So, global, multinational company. And for a long time, Unilever has been associated with its corporate purpose of being very careful about its impact on the planet and wanting to make planet friendly products and that sort of thing. Their corporate social responsibility, is very high. When you go up to their website today and you start to poke around a little bit, you begin to see that their current attraction and retention focus is on bring what you're passionate about into
Mhm.
your work. We can help you use that to make a difference in the world, whatever that is.
Mm,
And they have an onboarding process that focuses on that. They have a young worker track. And I think that's a 3-year long program where
mm,
they bring in, tomorrow's leaders and they help them to think about these questions. How do you want to show up as a leader? How do you want to show up in life? What matters most to you? What do you value? Now, how do we turn that into making a difference at work every day? And so they're inviting this in, and they've also got programs for people who are, mid-career and they're starting to think, now what do I do? I feel like I've got this position and whatnot, but I'm starting to get a little restless. One of the things that I've learned, Seth, in looking at the research on this is it is common. It, in fact, should be expected and natural for us to be reevaluating our sense of purpose as we go through and our value systems and what our priorities are. Anytime there's a huge shift in a
mm.
transition in our lives, it begins to awaken these kinds of questions.
Absolutely.
So, why wouldn't an employer have an interest in helping support people through those questions? Some organizations have life coaches that are part of the offering, purpose coaches are part of the offering. And now we see Unilever offering programs that meet people where they are in their career journeys and recognize that this is part of it. People are bringing these questions into what they're doing every day. So let's support that.
I love it. It's a really good fit with the onboarding process and the overall kind of career support. It feels safe to me. Like, that's not too scary. I'm not crossing any boundaries there. I'm helping people get clarity on this and lining it and all the rest. So that's really interesting. I thank you for that example. I really appreciate it. Well, we could go on and on, as we knew we would. But this was really great, Jessica. Any last kind of comments before we sign off? Thoughts on this conversation, or how to help employers further their conversations on this topic?
Yeah, I'd like to say this. Employers right now are really grappling with how do we get people's attention, especially when it comes to their health and well-being. We offer all these programs and services. This could be an untapped avenue for them because maybe you're not going to draw people there through the typical physical activity and all these other things. But when we can start to broaden our approach to well-being, we may now spark an interest in people. They're like, oh, well, one, I didn't realize that this had something to do with my well being, but we have to meet people where they are at. And so when we expand our offerings to these other areas, it gives people the opportunity to engage where they want to engage. And that then can lead to them engaging in other things. So I feel like this can be a very helpful strategy for us. And it builds intrinsic motivation for well being. So there's research too.
It's a great comment. And it reminds me of a few years ago, even before COVID, how we started to help people with financial issues, not long term planning, immediate planning, because that's where they were at. It was like, I need help with money. I'm not thinking about 7 glasses of water a day or anything else. So starting where people are at is a beautiful comment. Well, thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time. And again, have a great, purposeful life. Thanks,
Thanks.
Jessica.
Thanks, Seth.